Everybody ready to get started? Hello, everybody. My name is Lynette Mattiacci. I'm the coordinator for the Family Resources Center at the Pennsylvania School for the Deaf in Philadelphia, Pennsylvania. We're so happy to have so many of you joining us this evening for a webinar, which is entitled Strengthening Executive Function in Deaf and Hard of Hearing Children webinar with Dr. Matthew L. Hall. Now, before we get started, I do have a few brief announcements. This is a Zoom webinar, so you'll see on the bottom of your screen a few options. You'll see the QA, the chat option, and you'll see the globe icon as well. You can use the QA to submit any questions to Dr. Hall. Please go ahead and type them anytime throughout the presentation. I will be collecting and moderating those for Dr. Hall at the end of his comments. You can use the chat box, specifically if you have a question related to technology, and our IT department will be there to assist you. Dr. Hall will be sharing his screen, and then you can use the sidebar to adjust the size of the interpreter and the presentation screen. If you need Spanish auditory interpretation, you can click the globe icon for that translation. And this webinar will be recorded. We will be uploading it to our PSD website very, very soon, and I will get that information out to you as soon as it's ready. We are sincerely honored to have Dr. Matthew L. Hall from Temple University joining us this evening. He's going to talk about executive function and how we can better support and improve that executive function for our deaf and hard of hearing children. Dr. Hall is the Assistant Professor of Communication Sciences Disorders at Temple University. He runs the First Language Foundation Lab, which is dedicated to maximizing the development potential of all deaf and hard of hearing children through theoretical and applied research. He then applies that knowledge from cognitive developmental psychology and linguistics to questions that concern deaf and hard of hearing children. He is committed to increasing the quality of empirical evidence so that families and professionals who serve them can make better informed decisions toward the shared goals of promoting the long-term and holistic well-being of deaf and hard of hearing children. And now, with no further ado, let me introduce to you Dr. Matthew L. Hall.
All right. Well, first of all, good evening or evening for me, evening for most of you, I think. And let me thank you all so much for being here. It's tremendously humbling that so many of you, especially those of you with young children, would take time out of your day, out of your night to sit through another Zoom call. So I'm going to do my best to make it worth your time. I'll keep this part brief, but I do think you deserve to know a bit about where I'm coming from in all of this. Actually, before I get too deep into this, I just want to pause and make sure that we're all good. I can't see any of the interpreters on my end, which is okay. I just want to make sure that everyone else is okay. Can someone confirm? We okay? Oh, great. Okay, it looks like people are confirming in the chat, so everybody's good. All right, I'm going to continue. Okay, so as Lynette said, I'm an assistant professor at Temple, where I direct the First Language Foundations Lab, and I really see tonight's presentation as an expression of our lab's mission, where this is a chance for me to take some of the research information that we've learned and help you all to put it into practice, I hope. For the past couple of years, I've also been on the editorial board of the Journal of Deaf Studies and Deaf Education. And I also have the honor of consulting with several different organizations around the country, or in the US and Canada, Tonight, I'm not speaking on behalf of any of those organizations, and if I make any mistakes, those are all my responsibility. So let's get to the good stuff. What is executive function? So this is a term that we use to refer to a collection of mental abilities or cognitive skills that we all rely on to help us organize our behavior so that we can achieve our goals. It's called executive function because psychologists often use this hierarchical metaphor to talk about cognition, where at the lowest level, we have things like sensory processes like sight, touch, smell, reflexes. Those are at sort of bottom level with other automatic behaviors. And you can think of those kinds of mental processes as like low-level employees in a company. They do really, really important work, but they don't have a lot of control over the work that they do. At the upper end, the sort of executive suite, it's harder to pin down exactly what's going on up there, but the decisions that get made at that level have a really powerful impact on how the whole organization behaves. So executive function is referring to those sort of higher level cognitive processes. It includes many different subcomponents, and depending on who you talk to, you'll get a slightly different list. Tonight, I'll highlight attention. So in particular, we're talking about sustained attention, the ability to focus on one thing and ignore distractors. So you, for example, right now might be trying to focus on this presentation, and maybe there's chaos going on around you in the background. Your children might be trying to focus on their homework and not get distracted by toys or friends or pets or whatever. Working memory is another component of executive function. And this is about your ability to not only hold information in mind, but actively use that information. For example, if somebody asks you if you're available on a certain day, you might sort of mentally rifle through your calendar to see if you are, and you might even mentally rearrange your calendar to see if you can make time on a day. When you're doing that, you're using your working memory. Another component is cognitive flexibility. And this is about our ability to adapt and to roll with the punches as situations change. So if you're driving home on a familiar route and there's a road closure, now you need to figure out an alternate path to get to where you're going. Or if you've told your child that something is going to happen, but then plans change, your child needs to have cognitive flexibility to adapt to that new information or a change in rules or policy. I think all of us have had to have a lot of cognitive flexibility keeping pace with the COVID-related changes that we've all been experiencing. And then another one is impulse control. Sometimes I'll refer to this as inhibitory control. They're the same thing. This is about being able to withhold behaviors that we might want to engage in if we know that that's really not what we should be doing. You may be occasionally tempted to parent other people's children, and you know that that's not your job, and so you hold your tongue and you let that pass. Children also have to learn to regulate their own impulses so they don't take other people's things or hit children or hit other people or wait their turn, that kind of thing. Initially, most research on executive function, both in adults and in children, used pretty neutral, sort of decontextualized tasks. Basically, people would just come into a lab and do some funny task that had no real context. That situation is what we now call cool EF, sort of how we approach pretty neutral situations that don't have emotional content or high stakes. When we are dealing with a situation where the stakes are a bit higher, emotions are running more strongly, that's now what we refer to as hot EF. And it turns out that there's actually a different neurobiological network that is responsible for the hot EF and the cool EF. I'm not going to say much more about that for this presentation, but it can help to explain why we sometimes see different patterns when we, psychologists like me, for example, might ask children to do a task in a lab and everything looks fine, but their parents, when they fill out a checklist or questionnaire, the parents are noting all of these executive function challenges. Those kinds of discrepancies might happen because the parent is thinking about hot EF and the researchers are measuring cool EF. So just FYI there. So this graph, this comes from Harvard's Center for the Developing Child. And this is a schematic illustration of the development of executive function over an individual's lifespan. And there are three things that I want to point out here. First, if you haven't noticed, babies are bad at EF. Second, the peak of this graph, the highest point here, doesn't occur until young adulthood, sort of in the 20s, thereabouts. Rental car companies, I think, had this figured out before scientists did. But the third and the most important thing I want you to notice about this graph is this very steep period of growth during the preschool years. Sort of starts to tick up really quickly around age 3 and begins to level off around age 6, plus or minus. So even though it does continue to grow throughout the school age years, this early growth in the preschool period is a pretty important phenomenon. And if that growth isn't happening in a preschooler, that can be an early indication that they might benefit from some extra support. So understanding that developmental time course can also help us understand why we consider certain kinds of behaviors childish and why little kids and teenagers strike us as childish in different ways. So as I mentioned a few minutes ago, we can talk about mental abilities being organized in this hierarchy from lowest to highest. I've already described the lowest level of that hierarchy as being about senses and reflexes. A little bit above that, just a little bit above that, is what this graph calls system 1. And system 1 thinking is, as it says, very fast, involuntary, just sort of making snap judgments, quick associations. And we're often not even conscious of the processes that are going on in system 1. They're often very emotional. In contrast, system 2 is about the more deliberate, slow, controlled thinking that we associate with executive function. Right? So executive function is, belongs to system 2. There's an interesting pattern in development, though, as we look at how these systems grow in children. In childhood, both of these systems are pretty slow. This is part of why, for example, when a child falls down and gets a little bruise, it takes them a little while to start crying. Part of that is social referencing, looking to see if adults are telling them that they are hurt. But part of it is literally that the pain signal travels slower for them as the nerves are still developing. But here's where things get a little interesting. In adolescence, the nerves that belong to system 1 develop the ability to transmit signals faster, while the nerves that are responsible for system 2 have not yet developed that fast conduction ability. So in teenagers, we have this system 1 operating at full speed. So the emotions are flying, the associations are going, but the system 2 that is responsible for kind of putting on the brakes and helping regulate what to do, that system can't quite catch up in adolescence. Whereas by the time we get to adulthood, both of those systems have reached their mature level, and we see what we consider adult-like behavior. It's the interplay of system 1 and system 2. So that's the extent of the neurobiology that I'm going to talk about tonight. What I want to do now is explain why I think we should care about executive function. So for starters, research has found that executive function is actually a better predictor of school readiness than IQ or intelligence. And preschoolers' executive function abilities are also pretty good at predicting their academic achievement during the school age years. Now, I want to recognize that there are a couple of ways to interpret that pattern. The traditional interpretation is that having good executive function skills in preschool is a necessary precursor for learning later on. And then learning is measured in these traditional methods of standardized tests and grades and all the things that we're used to. And that's certainly a possible interpretation. I think it's also worth recognizing that other interpretations exist. So one of the things that executive function helps with is it helps people behave in ways that are expected in certain contexts. So things like being able to sit still, keep quiet, take your turn, do things on time. Those are skills that all depend on executive function. And so to the extent that our educational systems reward those things and punish other things, that might explain why this relationship exists. There are, kids with EF differences are certainly capable of learning and achieving all kinds of things. It's just easier for them to do that in some environments compared to others. Getting beyond the school outcomes, though, executive function is also pretty critical for success throughout life. So it's related to relationship satisfaction, to mental health, and even in some cases to physical health across the lifespan. So I hope we're all convinced that executive function is something that we should care about. Let's talk a little bit about what EF looks like in hearing children before we get to deaf and hard of hearing kids. So in hearing children, there is quite a range of executive function skills that's represented here on the horizontal axis. But the majority of children, by definition, fall into what's considered the average range, which is highlighted here, this middle 68% between about 85 and 115 on this imaginary measure of executive function. We would expect about 16% of hearing children to have unusually high skills. And that's great. We're usually not concerned about them. There's more recent research coming out suggesting that maybe we actually do need to be concerned about them in some ways, but that's a different presentation. The point that I want to make here is that usually in a typically developing population, we would only expect about 16% of that population to fall below this average range. Okay? And they are typically the ones who would probably benefit most from having some extra support. So unfortunately, there is by now quite a large body of evidence showing that in general, executive function remains a pretty vulnerable area of development for kids who are deaf or hard of hearing. And I'm representing this schematically here just to make the general point. The distribution of EF ability in deaf and hard of hearing kids is shifted downward compared to hearing children. As I hope you can see, this is definitely not saying that all deaf and hard of hearing kids automatically have deficits in executive function. There's lots of individual variation, and there's also lots of overlap in abilities between deaf and hard of hearing kids and typically developing kids. But overall, as a population, deaf and hard of hearing children are at much higher risk of having weaker EF skills, which is to say that the red part of this graph is a lot bigger than the red part of that previous graph. So given those findings, current research is aimed at two big questions primarily. One is to how to help strengthen executive function skills in deaf and hard of hearing kids who could use more support. This kind of work has lots of different names. Tonight, I'm going to call it intervention. The second question is about what we can do to foster healthy development in the next generation of deaf and hard of hearing kids so that their EF skills never show these kinds of delays in the first place. And so that's typically considered prevention research. Good. Perfect. So I'll spend a few minutes talking about what we've learned on the prevention side, and then I'll switch over to the intervention side. More or less, the prevention side may be of greater interest to those of you who have children who are sort of birth to 5 age, plus or minus. And the intervention side might be more interesting to those of you who have school age kids. But hopefully everyone will learn something from both parts. Before I dive into that, I also do want to acknowledge and in fact value the fact that there is and there always will be a lot of variation in the ways that people self-regulate and the ways that people organize their behavior. I think human neurodiversity is a marvelous and wonderful thing, and it can be very easily pathologized. So it's certainly not my view that every child who scores in this red area on a certain assessment necessarily needs to try to change the way that their mind works. I think in some cases, they may be best served by finding an environment where the way that their mind works is an asset rather than a liability. So this kind of horizontal variability is not what I'm trying to diminish. I actually don't want to see a world where everybody thinks in the same way. But this kind of shift, this downward shift, that's what I'm talking about when I talk about trying to prevent things. This shift is what suggests to me that there are lots of deaf and hard of hearing kids whose EF skills are weaker than they could be. And so what I would like to see is a world where we get to see the same range of EF skills in deaf and hard of hearing kids that we get to see in hearing kids. So I hope that makes sense. So in terms of prevention, usually the most effective way to prevent something is to figure out what's causing it in the first place. And so that has been the subject of a considerable amount of research over the past 15 years or so. And to be quite honest, we haven't totally figured it out yet, but we have made some good progress. And so in this part of the presentation, I'll introduce you to 3 main proposals that have been suggested. And we'll take a look at how each of those 3 theories stacks up against the data that we have. Those 3 theories each locate the root cause of this problem in a different area of development. So one thinks it's a sensory issue, one thinks it's a cognitive issue, and one thinks that it's a social issue. So let's have a look at these. So according to this sensory theory, the weaker EF skills that we see in deaf and hard of hearing children are literally a consequence of the child's hearing levels. So this view sees deafness itself as something that disrupts the development of executive function skills. That's certainly a very simple and straightforward explanation, but it's not the most intuitive theory. So let me explain why some people think that it makes sense. The basic idea is that the brain here is this massively interconnected system. And so the idea is that if you remove one piece of a very interconnected system, such as auditory input, then you should naturally expect to see consequences in other parts of the system, even if at first glance they seem pretty far removed from that missing piece, such as executive function is pretty far away from hearing. But according to these authors, and I'll just read the quote here, they say that auditory deprivation has widespread effects on brain development, affecting the capacity to process information beyond the auditory system. After sensory loss and deafness, the brain's effective connectivity is altered within the auditory system, between sensory systems, and between the auditory system and centers serving higher order neurocognitive functions. Different executive functions, sequential processing, and concept formation are at particular risk in deaf children. Right, so this is their view. That hypothesis clearly sees a causal connection between hearing, symbolized here as sound, and executive function, symbolized here with the gears. In addition, this view also takes the further step of arguing that this weaker executive function contributes to the delays that we commonly see in spoken language acquisition in deaf and hard of hearing kids. To me, that's a very striking claim, because for most children, language processing is a very automatic, effortless process. Language learning typically does not require much in the way of executive function skills, which is one reason that children are so good at it, even when they don't have very good executive function. So what these authors are saying is that for deaf and hard of hearing kids who are learning spoken language through hearing technology, the language learning process is actually much more difficult, and it requires them to engage those more controlled processes, like sustained attention and problem-solving skills, to try to figure out what it is that people are saying. So if this auditory connectome theory is correct, then the best approach to prevention would be to make sure that all deaf and hard of hearing kids have as much auditory access as possible, as early as possible. That's going to kick off the developmental chain that we'd like to see. And this is actually how our current systems primarily work. So in terms of early hearing detection, intervention, referral. So if this theory turns out to be correct, then we don't necessarily need to overhaul anything. We can maybe try to improve things just by tweaking the systems that we already have. So let's see how this theory does with respect to the data. It's pretty successful in explaining most of the empirical data, which come predominantly from deaf children who are born into hearing families. This is the case for 95% of deaf and hard of hearing kids. But doing pretty well and explaining most of the data is not good enough for a theory to be correct. A successful theory needs to account for all of the data, and there is a very an important set of findings where this theory makes a prediction that turns out to be very wrong. So remember that according to this sensory theory, it's deafness itself that disrupts cognitive development. And so if that's true, then deaf children who are born into deaf families should also show these same kinds of cognitive challenges. In fact, we might even think that they would be even weaker, given that historically deaf families have placed less of an emphasis on having auditory access through hearing technology. But when we actually go and measure executive function among deaf children who are born into deaf signing families, we find that their EF skills look just like those of hearing children. So this theory makes precisely the wrong prediction. So that's one good reason to believe that maybe deafness is not actually the root cause here. And so prioritizing auditory access above everything else may not be the most effective solution. So let's take a look at theory 2. This is a cognitive account, and what we'll call the language deprivation hypothesis. So whereas the previous explanation was about the absence of a sense, this explanation is about taking away a different kind of system. It actually shares a lot of the same logic with the sensory account. It agrees that the brain is a very interconnected system. And so if you take something out, if you disrupt one part of it, you should expect to see ripple effects on other parts. But it disagrees about what's actually really responsible for the biggest ripples. It points out that most deaf and hard of hearing kids have a lot less access to spoken language than hearing kids do. And a lot of deaf and hard of hearing kids also have very, very little access to a sign language. And so it may be that, in fact, disrupting the language system rather than disrupting the hearing system is why we see these difficulties so often in deaf and hard of hearing kids. EF and language are a lot closer together on that cognitive hierarchy than EF and hearing. And so because they're a lot closer together, it's sort of natural to expect that there might be a stronger connection between them. And this is actually not a new idea. It's at least 100 years old. There's a researcher named Lev Vygotsky, who was working in Russia in the early 20th century. And I'll read this quote. He says, "The specifically human capacity for language enables children to provide for auxiliary tools in the solution of difficult tasks, to overcome impulsive action, to plan a solution to a problem prior to its execution, and to master their own behavior." I don't think I've ever read a better description of executive function than that. He then goes on to say, "That which we take away from deaf children in communication will also be deficient in their thinking processes." So right away, 100 years ago, Vygotsky is making this link between deaf children's language skills and their executive function skills. He's writing at a time in Russia when the educational system had moved away from using sign-based education and was moving toward spoken language-based education. This is following the Milan Congress of 1880. And he is warning that he thinks this is a bad idea because the weaker language skills that he's seeing are going to have this ripple effect on executive function in these kids. So according to this theory, the causal chain begins with language input from an adult to a child. That language input allows language acquisition, and then that language acquisition helps with the development of executive function. And so if this causal chain is disrupted, that would explain why we're seeing challenges in both language and executive function. By the way, I recognize I'm using this same image on all of these slides. In the last one, it really did signify spoken language. Here, this image is being used as to include both spoken and sign languages. So if this theory is correct, what it means is that all deaf and hard of hearing children would need access to language as early as possible in whatever way will be most effective for that child. In some cases, that certainly might involve auditory access via hearing technology, but that's certainly not going to be the best way for every child, particularly not when auditory access to spoken language means waiting for 9 to 12 months for a cochlear implant or some other auditory device. But the current systems that we have are very much not set up to prioritize early language access. And so if this is the kind of, if this is ultimately the successful theory, we might need to advocate for more fundamental, larger scope changes to the systems that we currently have. So let's take a look at how this theory does with respect to the data.
Okay, correct.
One of the strongest points of this theory is that it has quite a good explanation for why executive function skills in deaf native signers are more robust or less vulnerable than they are in deaf children from hearing families, because these children have early access to language, and that is precisely what this theory predicts. In addition, there are two other things that this theory can do very well. It explains why in lots of studies of deaf children from hearing families, once we statistically control for differences in language ability, we usually see those differences in executive function disappear, which suggests that they really were linked to language, not really so much to hearing. And then this theory also makes a third prediction. It says that if there are other populations of children with weaker language skills, we should also expect to see weaker executive function in those children, even if they have typical hearing. And that is in fact exactly what we see in populations of children with developmental language disorder, sometimes called specific language impairment. So this theory is doing pretty well. I certainly, I mean, it's a theory that I have written about, so I'm a little bit biased. But it's my view that the cognitive story does a much better job than the sensory story of explaining the data, but that doesn't actually mean that it's correct. It certainly doesn't mean that it's complete. So from a research design perspective, it would be incredibly unethical to do the kinds of controlled experiments that we would need to do to really, really test this theory. And so what that means is that we always have to be cognizant of the possibility that there might be some other confounding factors that we haven't accounted for in this theory. There might be something else that's actually explaining the pattern that we see that we've just been overlooking. And so that brings us to theory number 3. This is the social account. Okay, so I realize that academics sometimes have a bad reputation of using very big words to describe very ordinary concepts. Here is a case where we deserve it. So I'm going to use this word intersubjectivity. That's what the advocates for this theory use. But first, I just want to make sure that we all understand what this means. So let me start with a quick example. Let's imagine that you and a stranger are walking toward a public restroom, and just as you're about to enter, somebody else comes out of the bathroom and you notice that they have some toilet paper on their shoe. But before either of you can say anything, that person is gone. And then you and this stranger just kind of look at each other and you kind of shrug and you kind of laugh and you move on. In that moment, you and this stranger have experienced intersubjectivity. That is, you both understood exactly what was going on in each other's minds. I really wish I could see you to see if you are still confused or if that made sense. I'm going to hope that it made sense. So in the context of child development, we can think about the development of that kind of shared understanding between parents and children. I'm sure that those of you who are parents, you're probably quite well acquainted with that feeling of knowing that there's something going on in your child's mind, but you don't know what it is. It's, that's kind of the absence of intersubjectivity. Certainly, I think you can probably think of times when your child doesn't know what's going on in your mind, even when you think you've been clear. And this is a natural part of child development. Intersubjectivity grows over time. And crucially, though, language is not actually necessary for intersubjectivity. It can help. It can definitely help. But the roots of intersubjectivity actually begin much earlier. So if you think about this, an infant may be fussing because maybe they're tired or maybe they're hungry. When a caregiver interprets that cue correctly, they sort of get it, the infant has that experience of being understood. Right? There's that like, oh, okay, this caregiver knows what I meant. They knew what I needed and they provided it. The same thing happens like when a toddler brings you their shoes to show that they want to go outside, or when they turn their head away to show that they're done with a game or a meal or whatever. Those moments of shared understanding belong to this idea of intersubjectivity, and certainly having a shared language makes it a lot easier to establish intersubjectivity, but its roots start much sooner, well before children are either understanding or producing recognizable language. So what does intersubjectivity have to do with executive function in deaf kids? So there's a researcher named Gary Morgan. I don't have his photo up here, but he and his colleagues have recently argued that it's those kinds of early social interactions between parents and children that, that facilitate both early language development and early cognitive development. Specifically, he talks about attention and self-regulation as being particularly sensitive to this intersubjectivity. So that might sound a little bit weird at first, because we're used to thinking of attention as something that I control. I as an individual determine what I pay attention to. How could somebody else determine what I pay attention to? And similarly, self-regulation, it's got self in the name. But when we look back at how these skills develop over time, we find that both of these actually start as a much more collaborative kind of effort. So young children are not very good at intentionally being able to shift their attention. They sort of, they get fixated on one thing and might have difficulty disengaging, or their attention might just be automatically grabbed by some other stimulus. Even if they wanted to continue attending to the first thing, they may not be able to resist reorienting. Parents can support the development of their child's attentional control by using what's called joint attention. So the adult takes advantage of their greater executive function abilities to figure out what their child is paying attention to, and then directs their attention to the same thing. So now the adult and the child are experiencing joint attention. They're looking at, they have the same shared focus. Similarly, on the regulation end, there's an idea called co-regulation rather than self-regulation. So if a child is experiencing some very heightened emotional state, either positive or negative, they may be overwhelmed, they may be sort of beyond what they're able to handle, they may approach a caregiver for support, or the caregiver may approach them for support. And something like a hug, a sort of deep pressure, slow breathing, those kinds of things are the adult helping the child to co-regulate their own emotions, their feelings. So over time, as the child's abilities grow and as these experiences with the caregiver continue, the caregiver can start to sort of step back as the child's abilities emerge. And we see this transition from joint attention to self-determined attention, and from co-regulation to self-regulation. So this is why Gary Morgan and colleagues think that there's a really strong relationship between intersubjectivity and these earliest emerging executive functions. Now, you might still be wondering what this has to do with deafness. So this is the second link in the Morgan et al. Argument. So there's also by now a fairly large body of research showing that hearing parents with hearing children and deaf parents with deaf children resemble one another pretty closely in the ways that they interact with their children. That sort of caregiver-child interactions look very similar in those two groups. But hearing parents with deaf children often have more difficulty establishing these kinds of joint social interactions early on, the kinds of things that support intersubjectivity. So hearing deaf dyads tend to be a little bit less sensitive to one another's bids for communication. They tend to have a little bit of a harder time establishing joint attention. Once again, this is not something that is always true of every hearing family with deaf kids. It's just a general tendency that is often observed across many different families. So if this story is correct, if the social account is right, then putting all of our focus on fostering language skills might not actually be the most effective strategy. Rather, if this theory is right, we should really be focusing first on finding ways to support this strong social interaction between hearing caregivers and deaf and hard of hearing infants. And we should be starting that well before they are ready to start understanding or using language. So let's look at how this theory does against the data. It's pretty hot off the press. This is really just started to be written about this year. And right now, it's actually pretty difficult to find any data that distinguish between the cognitive account and the social account. Both of them do a pretty good job of explaining all of the data that we have. The social theory has a little bit more of a complex interpretation of why these hearing children with hearing parents struggle with EF. It doesn't follow quite so neatly from this theory as it does from the language theory, but it can handle it. So right now we're at a point in the research where we've got one theory that's not so good, but two that are doing a pretty decent job. So currently my best recommendation would be that if your child is, say, birth to 18 months old or so, it's worth paying a lot of attention to fostering those really supportive intersubjective experiences where the caregivers and the child are really understanding each other. And then as your child gets a little bit older, you can shift your emphasis more toward supporting those developing language skills. Yeah, I think that's pretty much what I needed to say about prevention. So then we'll get ready to shift gears. And for the rest of this talk, we will focus on intervention. So how we can help children develop stronger EF skills. And that's much easier said than done. So when it comes to strengthening executive function, the good news is that it's possible. So all of the methods that I'm showing here have been shown to be effective in at least one randomized controlled trial. The bad news is that those effects don't always replicate. They don't always generalize to new populations. They often don't last very long, and they also usually don't transfer very far. So let me introduce two new terms here. The first is near transfer, and the second is far transfer. So near transfer is when training on some specific working memory task causes an improved performance on a different working memory task that they hadn't practiced before. We'll consider that near transfer. Far transfer would be if practicing this working memory task also improves inhibitory control or sustained attention. That would be far transfer. We don't usually see very much of that. So today what I'm going to do is touch very briefly on the first four of these, and then I'm actually going to spend most of the time talking about play. I wish that I could tell you that I'm doing that because the evidence for play is so much more robust and so much more effective than anything else. In truth, the evidence for play is sort of like the same kind of quality. It's like we have plenty of observations. They don't always replicate. But play certainly is the easiest, the least expensive, and also it's the most fun. So that's where I'm going to focus today. So we can start with curricular approaches. This may be of interest to any of you on the call who are administrators or educators who are looking for some more structured things to implement in your classroom. The best, most well-known of these, I think, is tools of the mind. I'm imagining that most of you are probably familiar with this already. This is mostly for younger kids, preschool, kindergarten, but it does have a pretty good evidence base. For older students in elementary age, the PATHS curriculum, so promoting alternative thinking strategies. So the PATHS curriculum was one of the first curricula for social emotional learning, which is distinct from but very closely related to executive function. And there's now an upward extension of that for middle school students called EMOSI. So if you're in that role, you might want to look into those. But implementing a new curriculum is very challenging, to say the least. So it's no surprise that there's been a lot of interest in strategies that are less effortful and also that can be more individualized to the particular needs of particular students. And so this is where computerized brain training comes in. there's a zillion of these. You've probably heard some of these advertised on NPR. The most common pattern in research studies that examine the effects of this kind of training is that there often is improvement in the trained skill. So there's evidence for near transfer, but usually not evidence for far transfer. And those gains are usually pretty short-lived. So if you stop the training, if you stop practicing, those skills tend to fade out over time. There has been one more thing I wanted to note on the curricular front. As far as I'm aware, none of these curricula have been adapted for deaf and hard of hearing students in particular. So if anybody is thinking about potentially implementing them, just be aware that they may need some major adaptation. Sorry, I just forgot to mention that. Back to the brain training parts, there actually has been one study specifically looking at computerized brain training for improving skills in deaf and hard of hearing children, particularly cochlear implant users. And that study did find evidence of near transfer. And they actually even saw some hints of a potentially far transfer and long-lasting results. So they saw it was a working memory training task, and they saw improvement on sentence recall that lasted up to 6 months later. So that's potentially exciting. However, the caveat with this study is that they didn't actually include a control group. And so we don't have any way to know whether the improvement that they saw after 6 months would have happened anyway, even without the training. So that's a little bit frustrating. There's other research that's explored the potential of interventions that integrate the mind and body, such as mindfulness meditation and martial arts training. To be transparent with you, this is the part of the literature that I know the least about. So take what I say with a grain of salt. But what I am aware of is the literature is very inconsistent. Some authors have certainly found evidence that these kinds of programs do improve executive function, but there are 3 kinds of objections that I've also seen in the literature. The first kind is an objection that says that it might not actually be anything special about mindfulness or martial arts. It might be actually any sort of physical activity, any sort of exercise or breathing that gets your blood flowing. It might be all that you need to help executive function. The second objection is that some people try to replicate these studies and are unable to find the same evidence that was reported in previous studies. So these effects seem like they might be a little bit fragile. The third objection is more on about martial arts. There are some studies that find that participating in martial arts training can lead to increases in violence. That probably has to do with the particular ways that the training programs worked and the particular context that they were in. But it's a danger to be mindful of. As far as I'm aware, there have not been any attempts to test these interventions specifically in deaf and hard of hearing populations. We clearly still have a lot to learn about what's going on here. So this would probably not be my first choice if I were looking for an intervention strategy. Another strategy that's been proposed for both preschool and school-aged kids is music. So if you're starting to sense a sort of extracurricular theme here, you are correct. What's interesting to me is that of all of these different intervention strategies, music is actually the one that seems to most consistently find beneficial effects. But naturally, almost all of the evidence comes from children with typical hearing. And so you might be tempted to assume that music intervention for deaf and hard of hearing kids is just not going to be effective. Certainly reasonable intuition, but it might be wrong. So there was a very recent study, it was published just this past fall, by Mason and colleagues in the UK. So they, in a randomized controlled trial, they tested what they described as the impact of a music intervention, where children received 10 hours of musical training in one condition and 10 hours of, I believe it was an art-based activity in the control condition. They reported that the musical training did in fact improve their working memory and their inhibitory control. So there are some features of that study that make me a little bit hesitant to get too excited about it too early. I would love to see if it replicates, but it's at least good to have something in a more well-designed study. Now, I'm not sure about you, but when I hear the phrase 10 hours of musical training, the picture that I get in my mind is of music lessons, formal, an adult teaching a child how to play an instrument. That's actually not the kind of training that this study engaged in. Instead, these children participated in 5 activities that were kind of loosely themed around music. But those activities were all specifically designed to target executive function skills. So another way to describe what was going on in this study is that these children played games together. And so that brings me to what I really want to talk about, which is play. So the term executive function, it evokes this corporate metaphor. Sometimes it makes people think of grown-ups in business clothes doing things that are very boring, but that's very much the wrong idea. So if I got to choose a wardrobe for executive function, I would put it in gym clothes, because these functions develop through exercise. And one of the most powerful ways to give your EF skills a workout is through play. But not all kinds of play are equally effective. There are some different types of play that emerge throughout childhood in a particular sequence. So let me highlight 3 of them. The first is act out play. So act out play is when a child is using real or realistic props. It's maybe they're holding a plastic phone instead of a real phone. But they are performing actions that are typically associated with that phone. So they will pretend to talk on it, all that kind of stuff. That's often the kind of play that we see in toddlers. Even when a couple of toddlers are together playing in this way, they're mostly playing in parallel, just kind of each doing their own thing. It's not really a joint activity between the 2 of them. And this particular kind of play is not expected really to have much of an impact on executive function. In contrast, as kids get a little bit older, starting to get into that preschool period where we see that big old spike in EF, they start to engage in more make-believe play. I'll also use the term mature play to refer to this. It goes by both names in the literature. So in make-believe, children take on a character that is definitely different from who they are as an individual. And now they start engaging in more creative ways of using things in the world. And that requires cognitive flexibility to imagine that a stick is a sword or a telescope or a magic wand. And because the situation that they are creating exists only in their mind, they need to use working memory to keep track of what's going on in this unfolding scenario. And to, if other children are involved, they have to remember who is who and what role they're playing and what's going on. So this is a much more powerful kind of play that's expected to have a bigger impact on executive function. As I said, it happens more during the preschool years. So if you notice that your preschooler is still engaging more in act-out play, that might be an important signal that their EF skills might need a little bit more support. It can be an early indicator. So make-believe play, it certainly can and certainly does persist into the school age years and even older sometimes. But as kids get a little bit older, they start to transition more, or they gravitate more toward more structured play like games. So these have specific rules that you have to follow. They have specific goals that you're trying to achieve, like winning. They can be either solitary or social. And their impact on executive function is going to depend on exactly what's going on in the game. And we'll analyze some of this stuff a little bit later on in the talk. First, I want to link these ideas about play and executive function to another concept with a fancy academic name that is a concept that you probably know already, even if you don't have the fancy name for it. So you might remember this gentleman from earlier in the presentation when I quoted some of his views about the relationship between language and executive function. So his theories about child development have had remarkable staying power. And one of his ideas that has stuck around most is what he calls the zone of proximal development, or ZPD. So this is a metaphorical zone. It's not a physical place, but it represents skills that are just a bit beyond what a child is currently capable of doing on their own. So it turns out that children don't grow very much when they only do things that they can already do. They also don't grow a whole lot when we ask them to do things that are just way beyond their capability. But when they're asked to do things that are just a little bit beyond where they are, that's an opportunity for growth. That's a thing that's they can step up to that challenge. The trick, of course, is how to get them into that zone. And the conventional response to that, the conventional solution, is to depend on what Vygotsky called the more knowledgeable other. Basically, this means a grown-up or an older child or a peer that has mastered this skill already. It's somebody who's just a little bit farther along that developmental path. They can help this child sort of, they can figure out what does this child need in order to do the last little bit on their own. So that kind of assistance from the more knowledgeable other, that's called scaffolding. And it's definitely a very effective way to support a child's development, but it is not the only way. So there's actually a second way to get children into that zone of proximal development, and that is to get them to turn the switch into play mode. So here's what Vygotsky has to say about play. He says, in play, a child is always above his average age. Sorry for the gendered language, by the way. This is a direct quote. In play, it is as though he were a head taller than himself. As in the focus of a magnifying glass, play contains all developmental tendencies in a condensed form. In play, it is as though the child were trying to jump above the level of his normal behavior. So Vygotsky's focus was mainly on preschoolers. And that is also true of most of the research literature. I think that's largely because preschool is such a critical time for the development of EF. And also because the nature of play changes as kids get into more structured games. But so whereas our understanding of the role of play in preschoolers comes mainly from the research literature, our understanding of play in the school age years comes mainly from the clinical literature as therapists figure out what's going to work for their particular client. And it looks like the same principles basically transfer pretty straightforwardly. So in other words, if we can get them into that zone of proximal development, that's going to be good for their EF. And one of the really most effective ways to get them into that zone is to follow the advice of a very wise person named Mary Poppins. So in other words, if there's a job that must be done, you add an element of fun and snap, the job's a game. Right? One of my all-time favorite demonstrations of this effect is a study from 1975 where the researchers just asked, they wanted to know how long can a 5-year-old stay still? I can't actually hear you, but I heard in my head all of you who have 5-year-old children saying none, they can't. But this research study, they wanted to measure this empirically. And so they asked the 5-year-olds just to stand still in a particular pose. It was like this. And they just took a stopwatch and timed how long they could do it. The interesting part of the study is that half of the children were just told to stand still, and that was it. The other half of the children were asked to assume the same exact posture, except that they were instructed to pretend that they were a guard or they were a lookout, and they had to stay there and protect the fort or whatever. So if this were an interactive thing, actually, I can see the chat, I think. So I'm going to go ahead and invite you to put your guess in the chat. How much longer do you think the 5-year-olds stayed still in the play context? Maybe I can't see. Oh, I can see the chat. Good. Yeah. Wow, your guesses are really quite impressive. I think if I were able to average them, you would be dead on. They were able to stay still 3 times as long. It was a difference of in 4 minutes with no instruction, which I was already impressed by for a 5-year-old. But when we gave them this play element, they stood still for 12 minutes. 12 minutes. So file that away for a tip the next time you need a few minutes to yourself. Okay. So that brings us to a more interactive part of the talk. I've been yammering at you a lot. I wish I could hear more from you. So at least this is a chance for me to hear a little bit from you. So what I want to do now is show you how to analyze the ways that executive function is involved in activities that your children already like doing. David, this might be a good place to start getting the first volunteer promoted to panelist. There'll be a little bit of time still. So you may, I'm actually not sure if you all received a link to a spreadsheet that looks like this. Oh, there it is, right in the chat. Hopefully, yes, I think that version of the link should work for you if you have a Gmail account. If you don't have a Gmail account, you might get an error message. I'm afraid I can't do anything about that. So let me explain how this spreadsheet works as you maybe open it in a different tab on your computer. It will, for you, it should look blank, I hope. And it should also ask you if you want to make a copy. You should say yes, make a copy. So yours should be blank. And that is for you to use to fill in on your own for your own child. The way this is structured, you would list some of your child's favorite activities in the activity column. You can add up to 10. And then once you have the activities listed, you can start working your way across the columns, and you can rate how much that activity requires the different type of executive function that's shown here. And you can rate them as low, medium, high, or not sure. Once you have something entered in every column, you'll get a little score over on the right. And that score ranges from 0, which is the lowest possible, to 100, which is, everything is as high as it can be. And that's the sort of indicator of how strongly that activity is tapping into your child's executive function, or perhaps building it. And so once you've listed a few different activities, you can see which ones are kind of high and which ones are sort of low. So here we can see that hide and seek looks like that actually is a very EF heavy activity, whereas in contrast, the card game War is pretty low. So that's also kind of what's going on down along the bottom in the horizontal part, except now this is measuring like across all of the activities that your child enjoys, what EF skills are really common in their activities and what EF skills are less common. So in this case, it looks like a lot of what this made up child enjoys involves sustained attention. And this child doesn't do a lot of activities that involve problem solving. So if we want to work on sustained attention in this kid, if this is a challenging area for him, this is great. Keep doing it, it's gonna help. If problem solving is what we want to work on though, it may be time for us to introduce some new activities that have more of a problem solving component so that they can get a little bit more practice. Okay, David, how are we doing with our first volunteer? Oh, I don't have the list. Whose child is youngest? I think we have two maybe who are preschool age. Either one will work. Or you can just give me somebody and we'll see who we get.
Yeah, I have a list of 4 people, but I have no indication of who goes first.
Let's take the first name on your list.
All right, Rebecca Pickering.
So as Rebecca gets ready to join us here, what we're going to do is she's going to tell me about some of the activities that her child likes to do. And we're going to think through the extent to which they involve these different executive functions. And I'm going to invite all of you who are not panelists today to do this in parallel, thinking about the kinds of things that your child likes to do and what those involve. So tasks that involve inhibitory control would be things that require turn taking, games where you have to sacrifice a short-term gain for long-term gain, anything that requires withholding information, staying quiet, following directions. Activities that involve working memory are things like remembering the locations of things, planning ahead, keeping track of what people know about you. Things that require cognitive flexibility are improvisational or have people take different roles. Maybe the rules change, maybe new information comes in, those kinds of things. Sustained attention, I think, is pretty familiar for most people. It's just staying vigilant, finding the differences between things, ignoring distractions, tracking things over time and space, paying attention to what other people are doing. Problem solving involves, figuring stuff out, finding the answer to riddles or solving puzzles, playing 20 questions. These can also be physical. They don't have to be mental. So figuring out, a backyard American Ninja Warrior course can be a problem solving task. And then emotion regulation. This is usually not directly involved in games, but it's often a byproduct of them. Being a gracious winner or loser, waiting your turn, that kind of thing. And then finally, persistence, tasks that involve repeated challenge, that you can't quite get it the first time, you've got to keep working at it. Learning to juggle, solving a maze, doing cat's cradle or jump rope, all those kinds of things. Okay, so it looks like I think what I need to do is cut my slides and then go to the spreadsheet. And now, can I see somebody? Rebecca, I'm told that you're here, but I'm afraid I still can't see anybody. But we can just.
I'll try and pin her. Maybe that'll help.
I think it might just be my Zoom.
Maybe if I start talking, will I pop up or?
No, but I can hear you. That's okay. I'll wave and pretend that I can see you.
Okay. Hold on one second, because I'm going to pin you too, Matt. So we're all pinned here. Okay. Now everybody should be able to see everybody. Okay, we're good.
All right. So Rebecca, hi, thanks for volunteering for this. Can you give me maybe, I'm also keeping an eye on time. Do you want to just tell me one thing that your child likes to do?
Sure. My son, he's 5, and he's deaf. He loves to play catch, like play ball or frisbee in the yard.
Mm-hmm. Awesome. So let's take a look at that. Inhibitory control, that's a pretty low inhibitory control demand. There's not like, you don't really have to override your first instinct to catch a ball.
Right.
You don't have to have a lot of working memory or a lot of cognitive flexibility. You do maybe need some sustained attention. Just this can be a repetitive behavior, so it's easier to get bored of it sometimes. So we call that a medium. Catch doesn't require a whole lot of problem solving. It does sometimes require emotional regulation, right? If you drop it, sometimes you get frustrated with yourself. And persistence, we can give that maybe a high in persistence. So overall, it's kind of a mid to low EF activity.
Okay.
Do you want to give me one more?
Sure. He likes to play a memory match game.
Okay.
Mhm.
Love it. Also pretty low for inhibitory control, unless, does he play it in a way that involves turn taking?
Yes.
Okay, so he's got to wait his turn. We'll give that at least a medium. What do you think this one's going to be?
It's going to be high.
I agree, yeah. So memory match games are really, really good for building working memory. Probably pretty low on cognitive flexibility unless there are any rules of the game that make it more complicated.
No.
No. What would you say for sustained attention?
I would say you'd have to pay attention. He
I
does
agree.
well with it.
I
High.
agree. Yeah, I'd call that pretty high.
Yeah.
But the task is pretty straightforward. It's not a lot of problem solving. I'd say pretty low. How about emotion regulation? Does he have times when he gets frustrated or overjoyed?
Yes. When he wins, throws it in your face.
Sounds like a 5-year-old.
But sometimes he cheats too. Sometimes he likes to cheat. But
Okay, yeah. So maybe we'll call that a medium.
yeah.
And then persistence, maybe also medium.
Yeah.
Right. And so we can see that this memory game is definitely more intense in its executive demands than playing catch. Beautiful, Rebecca. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
So Lynette or David or someone, 8:30 is our target end time, right? Yes. All right. So can I poll the audience real quick? So we can basically there's 3 options. We can do more of this, what we're doing right now with more panelists. We can, if you get the idea of how this works and you already think you can do it on your own, we can move on to, I can teach you another game that you can play with your kids. Or we could go a little bit late and try to do some of both. So option 1, more of this only. Option 2, I'll teach you the game. Or option 3, let's do both. Okay, it looks like I'm not seeing any 1s. I'm seeing quite a bit of 2s and 3s. So let's do a little bit more. Let's have another panelist come up and do some more of this. And then I'll make sure to save some time to also teach the game.
Matt, I promoted Laurie Estridge to panelist.
All right, Laurie, welcome. Thanks. Real quick, Linda asked a question in the chat about the point values for low, medium, and high. It's not quite that simple. The way that the formula works is all sort of about, the short answer is no, I can't, I'm sorry, but I can try to make an Excel version of this spreadsheet that maybe more people can open, and maybe Lynette can distribute that. So Laurie, is it?
Yes.
Great, nice
Can
to meet
everybody
you.
hear me?
Yes. So tell me a little bit about your child and what they like to do.
I have a son, he's 6 years old and deaf. One of his most favorite toys to play with is his racetrack. So it's like a glow in the dark racetrack with battery operated cars, and he'll like add attachments like a tunnel or a dinosaur that closes its mouth, and
Oh, wow.
a bridge, and so he'll also try to rearrange the cars like from fast to slow, and yeah, he'll play with that for a really long time.
Oh, very cool. Okay, so what of the things that we have listed here, is there anything standing out to you already that you're thinking, oh yeah, it's high for that?
I'd probably say sustained attention. He
Mhm.
really enjoys it and stays with it for a while.
Yeah.
Um, Probably cognitive flexibility is medium to high. He's putting together all of these different bridges or obstacles.
And is it the case that the way the track is designed, there's a zillion different ways you can put it together?
Yes.
Yeah, definitely. Yep. So things like that. So anything like Legos, Minecraft, all like building kinds of things are often really good ways for a kid to show cognitive flexibility. Good. And then it also sounded like persistence might be high with this. There's another component of EF that's some people differentiate planning from persistence. Some people kind of think that they're sort of the same thing. It sounds like this activity involves a lot of planning, where he's sort of organizing things ahead of time and spending lots of time on the setup, and then you get the big reveal, right?
Yes, yes.
It sounds like it might involve some problem solving, at least maybe some medium. I don't know about, doesn't sound like it's too heavy on inhibitory control. Not sure about working memory. I'll give that a not sure.
Yeah.
And then how about emotion regulation? What do you think?
I don't see too much of that. He's pretty content with whatever he creates. And
okay. Yeah, so maybe we'll give that low for emotion regulation. We can see it's again a pretty decent score there for EF activities. Now, as we start to look across the bottom, obviously we're talking about 2 different kids and we only have 3 activities listed, but we're already starting to see that sustained attention and persistence here are a common theme, but problem solving and inhibitory control are a bit less common. So if we were talking about one child who had this profile, we might want to think about adding in some activities that have those elements in it. Laurie, thank you so much. Really appreciate it.
all right, thank you.
So I think what I'll do now is go back to the slides and teach you all a game so we get that in. And then if we have more time, more questions, you can stay on and chat a little bit more. So one quick plug, if you like this idea of adding more activities, but you're not quite sure what to think of or where to go, this Center for the Developing Child at Harvard has this beautiful list. I think I have this up. Let me just put this in the chat so you can all have easy access to that. That is just a list of activities and how they support executive function in kids of different ages. Bear in mind that is all for, it's designed for kids with typical hearing, so you may need to adapt some. Here is a game that does not need to be adapted for deaf and hard of hearing kids. So this is a game that I grew up playing. My family only ever called it the hand game. Maybe some of you even know it. I haven't met many people who know it, but it actually involves a lot of different EF skills. It's easy, it's fun, it's free. You don't need any hearing. You don't need any language. I'd say it's pretty good for ages 5 and up, but with some rule modifications, you can do it even with with younger kids. And I think it's best with 3 or more players. So this is my first time trying to teach this game on Zoom. We'll see how it works. But my research assistants helped me make some videos, so hopefully it'll work. So the first thing you do is get into position. So the players will all put both hands on the table, and you'll overlap with the player on your right and on your left. Here's what it looks like. These videos are all just silent. Okay, so that's the starting position. Doesn't matter whose hand is over or under, you just want to have other people's hands in between your own. The next thing you do is introduce the rules, and there's only 3 rules. The first one is that a single slap passes the turn to the next hand in the direction of play. So you'll see them demonstrating that rule. Okay, so that's you're 1/3 of the way done. Rule 2 is a double slap skips the next hand. It's not the next person, the next hand. So here is a video of them demonstrating that. Okay. And rule number 3, the last one, a single knock reverses the direction of play. So you'll see them using slaps, and then you'll see how a knock changes the direction. Got it? So the way the game works, everybody starts with both hands in. One player begins, doesn't really matter who, doesn't matter which direction you go, you just have to, someone decides. And then you play until someone makes a mistake. And a mistake can be responding when it's not your turn, not responding when it is your turn, or using a response that's not valid. Like in this case, if you were to use a double knock, that's not one of the valid options. When somebody makes a mistake, they remove that hand from the game, and then a new round begins. So in this next clip, you'll see the play begin, and it's going to proceed until one player makes a mistake. Here we go. So the player in black flinched, like she moved her hand when it was not her turn. So she takes that hand out, and now the game continues with her other hand still in. So I'm now going to show you a sped up version of the whole rest of the game, just so you can see how it unfolds. Here we go. See if you can follow along. It is fast. So. And so the game really, once you have 2 people left, it's basically both people win. There's not any point in continuing beyond that. So 2 people get to share victory, and that's the hand game. So the other thing I want to highlight about it is that it's also quite flexible. You can make it easier for younger kids by only playing with 1 or 2 of those rules. And if people want more of a challenge, you can also have the winner make up a new rule. Like maybe you want to add in a double knock, and that reverses and skips somebody. Maybe you can make up whatever you want. It's very open-ended and flexible that way. There's, just in case it wasn't clear, there's zero empirical evidence, no peer-reviewed data demonstrating the effectiveness of this particular game. I just think it's quite fun, but it's very consistent with everything that we know about what should improve EF. So that brings me to the end of the presentation. I know that we have a very diverse audience today. I hope everybody learned at least something that will be helpful, whether it's about the theories about what's causing EF trouble, strategies for intervening, or at bare minimum, hopefully you all learned at least a fun game. If you'd like to learn more about the work that's going on in my lab, you can find us on social media if you look hard enough, but I'm not very good at that. In fact, as embarrassing as this is to say, I still don't actually have a lab website. But if you scan the QR code, that'll take you to a quick form where you can sign up to get periodic emails from us or express interest in either like employment opportunities in the lab, or if you want to come study for your PhD in my lab, or just find out what if there are opportunities for research participation. You can sign up for all of that at the QR code. So I think we do have questions in the chat. Before we do those, I just wanted to thank Lynette and the Family Resource Center, as well as all of PSD, and to thank our ASL and Spanish interpreter teams, as well as all of you. Thank you so much for being here tonight.
Thank you so much for your presentation. I really appreciate it. We've all learned and benefited so much from your presentation. Now, it is 8:30 right now. However, we do have some wiggle room, some flex time for another 15 minutes. Matt, if you wouldn't mind staying for a couple of questions, we really have 25 to 30 questions. I did take a look at some. If we do run out of time, I'd be more than happy to type them up and send them to you for a response. Maybe I can put them together in a document of some kind.
Sure. But I can stay for a little bit.
Wonderful. Awesome. Thank you so much. Let me go ahead. Some of the questions you've already answered, I have select them. One popular question is asking if they can have a copy of your slides from this evening.
Definitely.
Wonderful. Great. And I'd be happy to get those out for you. Thank you so much for making that available. So I'm just going to go in the order they were received. It says, Michelle here is asking, does executive function develop at a different pace for children with intellectual disabilities?
Yes, but if the question is EF slower to develop than other skills for children with intellectual disabilities, I don't know. Does that make sense? So in a kid with intellectual disabilities, everything develops a little bit more slowly. And I think EF is probably just at that slower rate along with everything else. It's possible that there might be some specific conditions where EF is even slower, but I'm not aware of any specifically.
So it's individualized, it's case by case, if you will. And here's another question asking, why do you think executive function is more important for school readiness skills than IQ? What is the benefit of that?
I honestly think that it is a lot about superficial behavior that's expected in classroom settings. I'm not convinced that it's really about readiness to learn. I think it probably has to do with sort of fitting into the culture of particular educational institutions.
Expectations, right? Okay. Let's see here. Dan is asking, for deaf and hard of hearing children who've experienced MRI, have there been any correlations between deaf and hard of hearing and hypoplasia of the corpus
callosum?
Callosum, thank you. The doctor seems to believe his last label of ADHD of hyperpallosum, but I've never heard any connection made to deafness particularly.
Yeah, that's new to me too. I'm not like I know some basic neurobiology, but I am not a neurobiologist by training. The corpus callosum, for those who are listening, that's the bundle of nerve fibers that connect your left and right hemisphere. And so this question is saying, for a child who has a weaker or a smaller band of that connective tissue between the hemispheres, is that related to executive function? It might be, but the corpus callosum, there's a lot of traffic that goes through there. It's not just the brain regions that are involved in EF. And so I don't know that I would expect EF to be any more impaired or weakened than any other cognitive function. And it would also, I think, depend if that was congenital or acquired. So if the child was born with that level of corpus callosum connectivity, usually those kids actually adapt to it pretty well. It's a little bit different if there's some damage that it gets weaker over time.
That makes sense. That makes sense. One moment for the interpreters to switch.
Okay, we have Amanda. I'm also curious. I'd like to know if all theories based on deaf children born to deaf families, or if this is, it doesn't matter if you have hearing parents that know sign language to communicate.
We have not yet had data that can tell those things apart. So it's basically really hard to get a large enough sample of deaf children from hearing families who also sign. One of the things that we don't know also is like, how much sign would you need in order to sort of qualify for that third condition? There's a lot of variability in how much signing hearing families use. I mentioned that point because this question is exactly what I was planning to do with my next research grant, and I got tripped up on this question of like, well, who counts? Does a family that knows 10 signs, do they count as a signing family? I don't know, and so I had to figure out a way to measure how much input a child was getting of different kinds of things, and that question took me off in a very different trajectory to a very different kind of work that I do now called language access profiles. And maybe that's another topic I can come back and present about another time.
That would be great. All right, kind of related. Next question. How do you get results based on deaf children with hearing parents based on diversity? I'd like to see data based on BIPOC and white populations.
Me too. And we don't have it. We really don't have it. Academic research most of the time enrolls participants by asking for volunteers. And if you think about who are the people who are paying attention to those opportunities, who are the people who have the spare time and the resources and the transportation to get to those studies, academic research tends to heavily overrepresent what's going on in highly educated families, white families, monolingual English-speaking families. And so we have an urgent need to know more about what's going on in a really population-based sample, but we don't have it yet.
Okay. Okay, here's a question. The way you describe intersubjectivity begs for a premise of relationship and nurturing by the caregiver, not traumatic neglect. That's important for developing EF. Any other thoughts on that?
I think you're exactly correct. I mean, that's completely the idea. So, well done.
Okay. It speaks for itself. Okay, Michelle asks, typically when you do co-regulation decrease, or when does co-regulation typically, when does co-regulation decrease is the question.
Okay. So there's lots of individual variation for sure. The general tendency is it should, for any given child, it should steadily decrease over time. But if you're asking about like on average across most children, again, during those preschool years, that like by the time a child is 5, 6, getting ready to go into primary school, it's the general expectation that they are able to sort of self-soothe, to sort of mostly regulate independently. Sometimes they might still need the teacher's support, especially in really highly emotional situations. But that's part of what is expected at school readiness, is that they've developed that ability.
Okay. All right, Megan asked, I was wondering if the deaf and hard of hearing community has more mental health issues due to low executive function. Any correlation between mental health and executive function?
Yes, and yes. There's a whole field of deaf mental health, and there's a lot of evidence that these early EF challenges, which are themselves related to having weaker early language access, that they have, unfortunately, continued negative impacts across the lifespan. So it's just even more motivation for us to work on these early attempts at prevention and early intervention, so that more people can sort of live their full lifespan up to their fullest potential.
Renee says, one thing social intersubjectivity is the development of the theory of mind for perspectives, which is also part of EFL skills and development. You didn't talk about that at all.
No, you're right. I was wondering if this question might come up. Yeah, so you are quite correct that intersubjectivity and theory of mind are closely related concepts. Those two, I would say, are more closely related to each other than theory of mind is to executive function. Part of this is actually just a historical disciplinary phenomenon. So theory of mind emerged out of psychology, and intersubjectivity emerged out of philosophy. They're kind of looking at the same thing from two different
A lot of layers.
angles. Yeah. I think the relationship that I would put between them is that theory of mind is a very small subset of intersubjectivity. So theory of mind is like one type of understanding what's going on in somebody else's mind, especially if we're thinking specifically of the experimental tasks like false belief. But yeah, intersubjectivity itself is a sort of broader state of being able to understand what's going on with somebody in a more general sense.
Okay, looking at the chat box, a lot going on, and looking at the time. I think we have time for maybe a couple other questions. Bethany says, when I taught drama at a deaf school, I noticed that my older students, even some of my middle school students, struggled with imaginative play. And I thought it was because of language deprivation, but now I'm reconsidering. How can I best foster this kind of cognitive flexibility for older students who've missed out on that valuable window of playtime experience?
Oof. I mean, it sounds like you're trying the right things in creating opportunities for them to engage in that creative play. If it's not working for them, I guess I would want to know if that is, if it's too far outside of their zone of proximal development, and maybe we can adapt the activities to build more gradually. Or these are teenagers that we're talking about. Are they embarrassed? Do they have friends who think that this is a dumb thing to do? Like as they approach adolescence, that system
Perspectives.
one emotional stuff starts coming in, and that can sort of get in the way of these play behaviors that might otherwise be helpful.
Improv or even the hand game might help with that.
And many theater, so I'm also a theater kid. Many theater troupes begin by playing some of these sort of warm-up games. So maybe you could try integrating the hand game into that context.
Okay, that'd be a nice icebreaker too. All right, I think we're going to need to wrap up. We're almost at 8:45. There are so many great questions I want to acknowledge. We'll go ahead and type those up in a Word doc and send them to you. If there's any way that you could respond to those, that would be great. And then I'll also include the slides from your presentation from tonight and send them to all participants. And I will also send an email to all participants once our recording is now available on our website. Again, very informative, very insightful night for all of us. Big thanks to Dr. Matt Hall for your presentation. It has been very beneficial. And not only did you share research, empirical research, but how we can apply it to the children that we live and work with. So we really do appreciate this. So often we have research and we don't know what to do with that information. So hopefully that'll help us take some steps forward.
Right.
And big thanks to our interpreters tonight. We had Josh Steckel and we had Donna Ellis. And we also had Clara Oliveras and Ana Jimenez for making sure that we had access for everybody. Thank you so much, everybody from all over the world for joining us tonight. It was great to see all of you and what you've shared. I'll be in touch with all of you. Enjoy the rest of your evening, morning, afternoon, wherever you are. So long. Thanks again. Thanks, Matt. Have a good night.